So we can say that we are now on air. Well, hello to everybody from my side. I am Georgios Plevrakis, Director of Global Sustainability for ABS. I just would like to say a few words. It's a huge honor to moderate this very interesting panel. Thank you to the organizers, yet another impressive event by Capital Link. Before we start, I will ask the audience to allow me to do some housekeeping. Like the panel before, and of course the panel after this, we have a very interesting topic to address. The level of the panelists in this panel also is a beacon by itself. I would hate to overlap with the panel following ours, and at the same time, I want to give to our panelists the time to express their view. Therefore, I would kindly ask for the questions to be reserved for the networking event after the panel, or to be submitted, and the panelists and myself will address the questions in a later time. Jumping straight to the topic, and in order to prepare some groundwork, I would like to say a few introductory words from my side. International shipping is facing the critical challenge of sustainability in response to global regulations for pollution prevention and protection of the aquatic environment. And as the industry prepares for the emerging regulatory changes in 2030 and 2050, there is consensus that we are entering a period of uncertainty driven by disruptive environmental legislation, which will ultimately be defined by the innovative solutions which will emerge. The rate of shipping transitions to lower carbon fuels will have the single biggest impact on its global carbon footprint, more than any predictable shifts in commodity demand and enhancement to operating practices, vessel routings, or ship designs. But taking the fuel topic aside, decarbonization can also be achieved through a matrix of solutions, including new efficiency technologies and operational optimization. Joining me today to discuss how a company navigates through these challenges and more are, starting from the lady of our panel, Ms. Ioanna Procopiou, CEO of Prominence Maritime. Welcome. Welcome, Ioanna. Mr. Alexander Saverys, CEO of CMB Group. Welcome, Alex.
Hello,
Mr. Christian Ingerslev, CEO of Maersk Tankers. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you.
Mr. Darr, Executive Vice President, MSC Group. Welcome, Bud. And Mr. Rajesh, Captain Rajesh. Welcome, Rajesh.
Thank you.
So to kick it off, I would like to pose a question to the panel after we have done this groundwork. What do you consider as the biggest barriers to decarbonization? I made a short introduction on the matrix of solutions, fuels, operations, efficiency technologies, the impact of regulations. But what is the biggest barrier that you see ahead of us right now? I would like to start with the lady of our panel. Ioanna?
Thank you. I was muted. It's a very interesting question because usually we look at it from the other side. So let's talk about what I see as the barriers for decarbonization. So I think that at the moment, from what we hear and what we have all been reading, there are no proven alternatives to fossil fuels. A lot of what is being suggested is not practical or available in a large scale. And in many cases, it doesn't even yield the environmental benefit that it is intended to do. In the past, it used to be the case that you had, first somebody would invent a new technology, then they would test it, then the regulation would come, and then they would implement it. But nowadays, we see all of this in reverse. So that has created a problem for the ship owning side and the side of the ships, because we have difficulty finding such a technical solution. Also, I think another problem to the path for decarbonization is that we lately have been hearing about local regulations, like the EU emissions trading scheme that is being discussed. So this leads to fragmentation. That is never a good thing, because it undermines the role of IMO. And as shipping is a global industry, you need it requires global rules. And just a small parenthesis for the ETS: when they imposed ETS to aviation, they didn't see any actual cutting of the emissions. Also, taxing emissions or trading emissions usually results in a pot of money, and it's a little bit delicate. Who will handle the funds? For what reason will they be used? And there's a question: can we trust the countries and the politicians to do such a thing? So I think from my side, at least, there's no clear path for decarbonization, or even a guidance towards the right path for decarbonization.
So in a nutshell, I would say that there is, what I have noted down is lack of clarity as far as the path is concerned, and practical solutions being proposed for the challenge of decarbonization, fragmented landscape as far as the approach is concerned, and not a global global approach. Which one of these elements, Alex, do you find that are the ones that are indeed the biggest barriers, or do you think that there are more to this?
I personally think that the only real barrier is the difference between the cost of new technologies and the cost of current fuels. Either current fuels become more expensive or new technologies become cheaper. I'm sure that if that cost barrier reduces, you will have people that will come up with solutions. As you know, we've been investigating hydrogen applications since more than 4 years now. And I'm actually very optimistic about the chances of finding new technologies that can solve the problem. But it's a cost issue. And when we talk about costs, someone has to pay it. Ship owners, operators, the end customer. So either we find something to bridge that gap, or we find a customer that pays for it.
Thank you, Alex. So Alex has also included in this barrier landscape the cost element as well. What would you put as a biggest barrier to this equation, Christian? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think if we just take a step back and look at our industry, then we work in an industry that hasn't really experienced any significant historical disruption. It's fairly fragmented, and the financial results that we have experienced for many years have been quite weak. But it's also an industry where we have a very clear incentive to pursue reductions because it directly impacts the bottom line. The challenge that I see is that it requires scale. And I consider that the biggest barrier for decarbonization. Smaller vessels owners, they don't have the luxury to make a lot of innovative bets, which besides sort of scale and requires data, capital, and external pressure from disruptive forces. So, the larger you are, the more resources, data, and impact to innovate and drive lasting change you have. And I think that's sort of a fundamental challenge that the industry faces.
Very interesting about your comment about the fragmented nature of our industry and the different speeds, but by which the different sectors the different players could move towards achieving their decarbonization targets. As far as this type of approach, looking at the at the fragmented nature of our industry. And I would like to get your response, Bud, at this. What do you see from an MSC perspective as the biggest barrier to decarbonization? Do you agree with the previous speakers? Is it something that you would like to add?
So I agree in part, and in some parts I differ in my view. So let me start with disruption, although I think that we definitely could talk about the scope of disruption. There certainly has been disruption in our industry over time. There have been other major transitions, you know, those in propulsion from oar power to sail power, from sail power to coal, from coal to oil and diesel engines. The difference with all of those revolutions was in each of those cases, technology had evolved, even if it was rudimentary technology of sail, to say, hey, here's something better. Why don't you do this? This is a totally different paradigm we find ourselves in, where this type of disruption is you can't keep doing what you're doing. You have to do something fundamentally different, but we can't tell you what the solution is. And I think the fact that we can't be told what the solution is where that fragmentation sometimes works against us, but it can also be a strength. Because I'd like to focus on the good in this, in the opportunity in it. And it is, if we open our eyes, if we maybe break ourselves away from our existing notions of what ships and propulsion have to be, maybe consult some young, bright minds that don't have those pre-existing ideas of what we've always done or what we have to do, maybe we have a wider suite of potential breakthroughs to come from. Because in our company, and we're a very diverse company, we're the 17 modern cruise ships, 12 ocean-going ferries, roughly 500 cargo ships, and then a lot of small coastal high-speed craft as well. And so we're kind of a microcosm of the broader industry, and we're finding there's no one pathway. It really matters a lot what the type of ship is, the service that you're going to deploy it on. If you're talking about a retrofit or even an investment in a new ship, what is the expected lifespan? And all the things kind of add up a bit differently with all these options, none of which are perfect options. They all have challenges to be overcome. But I'm optimistic that if we keep an open mind about those pathways and don't look for the one silver bullet, because I don't believe it exists, but rather look for a solution set that we can apply, in the case of our company, which is quite diverse throughout our enterprise, or in a broader sense throughout the industry, to match up the right solution sets with the right operating profiles. I think it's there. But the one thing that I think is probably the most important in this is that the thing that probably has to begin more seriously, the most urgently, is the longest term sort of payback. And that is, what are those best alternative fuel, differing technologies for propulsion, even in prime movers fundamentally, compared to what we have today? That's really the end state here, because all the other things we're talking about with energy efficiency or various transitional fuels or market-based measures are just stopgaps on that journey to get to that final answer. We can't get there soon enough, so that means we cannot have started much more seriously than we are as an entire community, not just ship owners, but academia and governments working together to get those solutions on a faster track than they are right now, because ship owners will respond. And when that financial gap that Alexander mentioned is narrowed, we'll jump right in there when those solutions are available.
Thank you, Bud. I find really interesting your notes on linking the different operational profiles, on how you actually select the proper solution based on your specific business case. So I understand that what you say is that one size does not fit all in this particular case, and the fact that this is so far not something that we have been used to in the industry. The fact that this disruption is bigger than the one that we had earlier. This is something that it's taking us out of the business as usual, I understand. Talking about business and market pressures or market opportunities, I'd like to shift the question now to Rajesh. We talked about biggest barriers to decarbonization. How does that affect your decarbonization strategy? How do you see market pressures having an effect on the strategy of your company?
Thanks for asking, George. I like the kind of responses that's coming from the panel. So just to try and find a link and correlation. See, normally a regulatory framework has, two types of adoption. One is when you have a robust and cost-effective technologies like the hull paints, then it gets adopted very quickly. And then you have this case where it's a new technology and there's limited test and feasibility studies, where it's somehow a little bit of the unknown. So for me, one of the things that IMO has set broad guidelines, but what we perhaps want is a more robust thermodynamic framework that maps the entire carbon cycle, CO2 cycle, whereby that gets access for people to make detailed problem statements and then potential solutions. So that's one thing that I see. And then obviously things like cost, which Alex mentioned. So if you look at data, I like to back up something with data. So if you look at the recent journals, right, and they say that if you have an Aframax ship that is on the base case with heavy fuel oil and NGO, and then if you want to achieve some of these reductions like in 2030, if you want to achieve 54% or 50% reduction in CO2, the only combination today is LNG as a fuel and then some exhaust gas recovery and carbon capture. So I feel carbon capture is an inevitable short-term solution. So in a nutshell, I think IMO needs to come up with a more clear plan before 2023 on the short term, so that there are still, I think, low-hanging fruits that we can capitalize on, whether it's EEDI, and we have done a ton of work on that, which I'm happy to talk later, or SEAM. And then obviously, once that is done, for companies like us who primarily look at ourselves as a trusted technical thought partner, this is a huge opportunity. I think we've invested time and resources for the last 3-4 years on this. So for us, we think this is a huge opportunity because the impact of these regulations are going to be multifolded. Like it's going to be on infrastructure, whether it's retrofits or new designs. It's going to be on competency of the workforce. It's going to be on new processes for this whole thing. It's going to be on new business models. It's going to be training to prepare these, competent workforce. And then obviously also creating awareness and acceptance that this is something that we need to collectively build for a sustainable future. So for us, the impact, I think, is very positive. Internally, also, there's a lot of challenge in saying, why do you want to invest your own personal time and resource into this? But I think it's a well-invested cause. And we are quite positive. So if you look at a couple of things that we have done, whether it is EEDI, we look at, air cavity lubrication is one thing that's come up with people. But what we're trying to see is, can we take off fouling itself by creating a stabilized nanobubbles by electrochemical reaction, for example? Or can we use batteries, which are not lithium, but green batteries, and using renewable energy to power them? Or we're talking about fleet optimization. We've been working with Maersk and others, where we've achieved 9% fuel optimization, which is 200 smart voyages, which is close to 8,000 tons of CO2, 25,000 case SOx. So there are small, achievable steps, I think, compared to always targeting the long-term objective first before working back. There are these steps that need to go in place to achieve the 2030 deadline. And that's more dependent on EEDI and SEAM. I think that is something that we can do. So we are very positive about this.
Thank you, Rajesh. I have been taking notes. I see that you have, in your company, you have created a very impressive matrix of looking at the different types of solutions, also on the maturity side, on the practicality side, what can affect your design index, what can affect your operations, and you're taking a very positive approach to that. Now, I'd like to shift gears a bit and see how we can implement decarbonization from a company perspective and practices. How do you build the strategy? And I'd like to address this question to Christian. Christian, how does Maersk Tankers, as a leading commercial manager, take its part in the decarbonization of the industry?
Yeah, thank you. So CO2 reduction is actually an integral part of our strategy. It's one of the three key metrics that we measure success against. And we think this is important because the part of the industry we are in the tanker side, it is very fragmented. And that's also why we think that larger companies, they need to take a step forward if we are to reach the reduction goals that we have set forward within the IMO. So we drive this through the use of our scale, and we do that in 4 areas. We attract new partners. So we've grown significantly from 160 product tankers to 225 over the last year. And that allows us to constantly optimize our trade patterns. Then, of course, we explore new technical solutions. So amongst others, we've been testing these rotor sails on one of our vessels, reaching 8.2% reductions in emissions. The third is that we are developing digital solutions. So far, our investments into digital solutions, which is about $9 million over the last 2 years, has led to a software product we call SimBunkers. And it reduces CO2 emissions and improves thereby also bunker spend by optimizing speed, route, and procurement. And we've actually decided that we are spinning off this software into a new standalone digital business, allowing it to really accelerate to become more of an industry tool rather than an in-house thing for Maersk Tankers. And then lastly, we engage in partnerships. This is not something we can do alone. And as Bud mentioned, it's about really thinking what is the breakthrough technology longer term. So we are one of the founding members of the Getting to Zero Coalition, where sort of like-minded companies come together to look at these breakthrough innovation opportunities.
So there is a multifaceted approach, I see. Optimization of trade patterns, so it's optimization of utilization, introduction of energy efficiency technologies, and all this being enhanced by digital solutions. Last but not least, participation to big industry forums where the exploration of, specifically for this Getting to Zero Coalition, the exploration of new alternative fuel solutions is the key. Having said that, and I'd like to get back to the lady of our panel, Ioanna. The industry is focusing a lot on the potential of alternative fuels as the big contributor to the reduction of maritime emissions. What do you think the focus should be when one is evaluating that potential?
I'm very tempted to go back to what Rajesh spoke about, the low-hanging fruit. We haven't mentioned operational measures for low-hanging fruit towards decarbonization. Slow steaming is one of the most proven and easily implemented low-hanging fruit for reducing CO2 emissions. I'll give you an example. In 2015, we saw 30% reduction in carbon intensity compared to 2008 levels. So this is a huge thing that could well be an interim solution for the longer term towards the path for decarbonization, because the more we pollute now, it's going to stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. So until technology catches up with us, slow steaming is a great alternative. But anyhow, I'll go back to the interesting question which you placed in me. So
that was a good link with what Christian was saying earlier about optimization of utilization. So it was a good point there.
Thanks. I think that the most important factor when we look at a new fuel or a suggested fuel is, first of all, to have a proven environmental benefit. So in order to do that, one should look throughout the life cycle of a fuel. So we should have a holistic approach and have clear and proven environmental impact for such a fuel. And that also means that it's sustainably sourced. Until now, regulation is from tank to wake, which means from the time that you put the fuel on board your vessel and until you burn it in and it's producing a movement in your propeller. There is a huge part before that, which is the fuel production, which is extraction, processing, refining, transportation, distribution, the bunkering, and then the combustion. So in order to have, let's say, a real environmental decision as to where this is a sustainable, environmentally sourced, etc., you need to look at the whole process, which is called from well to wake. I'll give you an example. Ammonia, which is would be considered carbon neutral if it was produced from renewables. At the moment, it's very expensive to do such a thing. So we are producing ammonia from fossil fuels. Therefore, this is not an environmental fuel. Again, we went to very low sulfur fuel oil and ultra low sulfur fuel oil. Apart from the fact that there is some research demonstrating that SOx do have a cooling effect for the atmosphere, the production of the compliant fuel requires more energy. Therefore, the emissions are increased towards the production phase of the fuel production. Again, if you cut forests to produce, to grow crops that will produce biofuels, again, we cannot call this sustainably sourced. So I think one part of this whole equation is very much how this fuel ended up in the tank of the vessel. I think a very important factor is that we need bunkering infrastructure that will be enough to have bunkering ports in all continents in order for the vessels to be able to sail safely around the globe. At the moment, LNG, for example, that is a marine fuel that has been around for about 40 years. Still, we only have about 2% is used as fuel. And the problem with that as well is that it has very few bunkering stations, apart from methane slip, which is another topic that I will not touch upon. Then when we're talking about another, an alternative fuel, we need to have a fuel that is safe for burning in the engines and safe for humans to handle. A lot of the new fuels that we're discussing are toxic and they have difficult handling, either requiring very low temperatures or high pressure, or are toxic. Also in the case that it was a relatively easy transition from HFO to very low sulfur fuel oil. When ship owners started burning this fuel in their engines, we saw a lot of problems with this fuel because it is an unstable fuel, it cannot be mixed, it's aging very fast, it has a huge variation between where you get it. So we had us, as well as many other companies, had the blocking of filters, we had damages in the cylinder linings, etc. And in many cases, this can lead to blackouts, which is very dangerous, especially when you're in narrow corridors. Also, another thing that we need to consider when looking at an alternative fuel is the energy content, the energy density of the fuel. Hydrogen, for example, has about 1/4 energy content of the HFO. So as you can understand, if it's 1/4 of energy content, you need 4 times more tanks or more fuel in order to have the same energy. Therefore, it affects to a big extent the design of the ship and its carrying capacity. Because if you have 4 times more tanks, you have a lot less space for fuel. As the same is for batteries. Actually, it was an ABS that George, you showed us this presentation, that if you have a 2000 TEU container to be able to travel 2,000 nautical miles with batteries, 70% of the vessel would be batteries. So again, it is a huge problem when it comes to considering these things. Also, you need to dispose batteries in an environmental manner, which again is questionable. Now, moving on to cost, which is something that Alex mentioned, and of course, it's a huge impact to the decisions. And as other panelists mentioned as well, the market has been quite weak over the last few years. So you cannot expect to make these huge investments unless they're also going to make sense for the end users. Let's say, for example, when we went from HFO to VLSFO, we had 30 to 60 billion more bunker fuel costs. And this is only from a relatively easy transition. So with such high capital expenses for redesigns and retrofits, the employment of the vessel needs to justify pouring all this money into your assets. Of course, you can have early adopters, which are ships that are already burning LPG, for example. They can use it in dual fuel engines as well as LNG again. But it is very much on a small scale at this point. I think I'll put a full stop here and let you get on with the rest of the questions.
No, thank you, Ioanna. This was actually, you have framed the problem of fuels in a very efficient way. There are a lot of aspects that one needs to address. What I've noted is that you have raised the fact that sustainability in relation to fuels has to address a wider range of topics, not just the tank to wake perspective and emissions, but also cost, availability, sourcing, and of course, safety. And I have also taken a note about the maturity of solutions. You've mentioned batteries and the recent and related industry reports. As far as the maturity is concerned and what type of selections are available and options, Alex, I'd like to shift gears by asking a question to you. We know that CMP is investing a lot in new technologies. In fact, in the introduction of this discussion, you mentioned that. And making the link also to the previous speaker about the different options of the technologies and maturity rates. How does that factor in your strategy? The different maturity rates of technologies.
The maturity of the technology will depend on the amount of money we can invest in it. I think if we invest the money that we have invested, for instance, in scrubbers, $15 billion, if we invest the money we have spent on top between high sulfur fuel oil and low sulfur fuel oil, what Ioanna says is $20 to $40 billion, if we would have invested these kinds of amounts of money 10 years ago into new technologies, the ships would already been there. I fully agree with Ioanna that there's a lot of questions about the sustainability of hydrogen, ammonia, batteries, etc. I do think that that's not my problem. I'm a shipping person. Let shipping people invest in good ships. Let shipping people invest in the shipping technology, and the rest will follow. I've never, I think, in the history of our company, invested in an oil well or an LNG production facility. We just took the fuels that were available, obviously taking into account the cost. So basically, on the maturity, I can say only two things. I think we can get there if we invest sufficient amounts of money. There's a lot of bright people and entrepreneurs out there in shipping that can find solutions. And obviously, we can't do it by ourselves. I fully agree with Christian and actually with everybody on the panel that we have to collaborate and work together. Eventually, we will need the help of our customers and suppliers. We can't pick up the bill ourselves. We can't do the technology ourselves, but it is feasible. We can do this by 2025. We can do this by 2030, and we can definitely do it by 2050.
This is a good note to lead us to the conclusive question that I'd like to raise to to this panel. Alex, thank you for raising that. What would you propose to the global maritime community to promote environmental sustainability of our industry? And I'd like to listen to Bud on this.
What I'd like to propose is real commitment, and commitment from the entire community, not just the ship owners. I agree with Alex's comments. It shouldn't be for us to develop all the technical solutions here. It should be for us to buy good quality ships with the best available technology and operate them efficiently over their lifespan. And in some cases, we can improve the operations. I thank Ioanna for highlighting what is actually a very fierce debate within the industry as to whether or not slow steaming is low-hanging fruit, or whether it's a distortion in the marketplace or not suitable for all ship types. We take a somewhat different view of it, but that's an ongoing discussion I won't go into. But we can operate ships more efficiently. In some cases, that means operating at slower speeds and operating with maybe with reduced power that's suitable for the service it's going to be in. So I think binding together, really being optimistic and serious about deploying the technologies when they become available, making good choices in design, good choices in fleet renewal, good choices in operation, and recognizing this is a very real problem, that although, you know, some estimates are maybe 2.2% of the anthropogenic emissions come from shipping at the moment, that doesn't mean it's not our problem. It is our problem. We have to do our part, and we have to be very, very serious about living up to the expectations of ourselves, our customers, and society as a whole.
Living up to expectations of society as a whole. Rajesh, any final notes?
Yeah, I have three things. One is what I said earlier: take the IMO guidelines, build a robust thermodynamic framework, capture the entire CO2 cycle, to Ioanna's point, okay? And put power, energy density, safety, and all in the metrics. The second, look at megawatts. When I'm saying megawatts, is negative watts. Try and look at how do you save energy versus losing them. And third, you know, carbon conversion, carbon capture is part of the inevitable process. Then look at carbon capture with conversion. And finally, I think there must be some incentive, whether it's through a levy, I don't know what, but there must be incentive, to Alex's point, to spur the innovation and adoption. Because I genuinely think this is the right thing to do. And I'm 100% confident if we do that right, we will get there. There is enough that we can do before we reach 2030 in terms of SEAM and EEDI. So I'm positive about this.
Thank you, Rajesh. Christian, you mentioned getting to zero coalition. More or less, you have given us a flavor of what you think about this last question. Any last comment on what we can do as a global maritime community to promote environmental sustainability?
Look, I think the maritime industry is hugely important for the world, and it's the most energy efficient way of transporting goods. But we need to become more sustainable as an industry, and it requires profound changes in the way we operate today. So it's of course a challenge, but I also really think we need to start looking at it as a huge opportunity. It's an opportunity that we need to embrace, and we need to be the ones who step out and create the sustainable future. And there's significant financial incentive to do that. So to me, it's really about coming together as an industry and ensuring that the environmental agenda is ours. That's really the key for me. I think we need to turn it around.
Thank you, Christian. And Ioanna, any final comments?
Just a quick one. I think, first of all, as everyone has said, it's very important for everyone in our industry to understand that the environmental is improving the environment is a necessity. So we have to stop pushing the envelope and to take decisions that are long-term based. And the other thing that we as a company have found very, very helpful is involve also environmental groups in the discussion, because they, at the end of the day, they care about the environment, and it's very important to have their view. I mean, whenever we've done discussions with them or meetings with them. We find it very, very helpful. So this is another idea.
Thank you, Anna. So at this moment, our time is up. Thank you to all of you. This has been a great discussion. I think that we have raised a lot of topics. We have addressed the need for regulation, the clarity from regulation, the need to approach the decarbonization problem from many sides, look at it from a wider range of perspectives, and at the end, come together in a global initiative and address the challenge. I would like to thank the panelists and thank the audience for staying with us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It's really been my pleasure.